Henry VIII, a name that echoes through history like thunder. A monarch whose every move shocked the world. He wasn't just a king, he was a force of nature, reshaping the fate of a nation and the course of history itself. Imagine a man who, in pursuit of one thing, an heir, unleashed a whirlwind of scandal, betrayal, and a revolution that would change the world forever. A man who had 6 wives, executed 2 of them, and left behind a legacy that still sparks debate centuries later. This is the story of a king whose appetite for power, love, and control tore apart the very fabric of society. But Henry VIII wasn't just driven by the desire to rule. No, it was his burning need to secure his legacy, a son, an heir to carry on his name, that would lead him to defy the very church that had guided his kingdom for centuries. His break with Rome, his creation of a new church, would forever change the world of religion, politics, and royal power. But it wasn't just his actions in the grand halls of power that made Henry VIII infamous. His marriages, his mistresses, and his ruthless decisions were as scandalous as they were game-changing. With each wife, he tore apart his kingdom's moral fabric, and with each decision, he sealed his fate and the fate of England. So, who was Henry VIII really? Was he a tyrant driven by a thirst for control, or a tragic figure consumed by his failures? What pushed him to kill the very people he once loved? What drove him to challenge the Pope himself? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the truth behind the legend of one of history's most controversial and unforgettable kings. Trust me, the shocking twists, the betrayals, and the power struggles you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about this notorious monarch. Stay with us, the story is just getting started. Henry VIII was never meant to be king. He was born in 1491, a second son, with no expectation that he would ever wear the crown. His birth was marked by the tension and relief that followed his father, Henry VII's victory in the Wars of the Roses, England's long-standing civil war. Henry VII, after years of conflict, had finally united the 2 rival houses of Lancaster and York by marrying Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the defeated Yorkist king. This marriage brought peace, but peace came at a price, and it left the throne burdened with questions of legitimacy and fractured loyalty. For most of Henry VIII's early years, the throne was not his to claim. His older brother, Arthur, was the heir. Arthur, with his regal demeanor and poised nature, was prepared for the throne. He was the golden child, the one who would lead England into an era of stability after years of war. Henry, in contrast, was the spare, a child born into a world where the weight of kingship was not his burden to bear. His life, for years, was filled with the typical luxury of a royal prince: education, hunting, music, and tournaments, but the future of a nation was not placed on his shoulders. Instead, he was taught the duties of a prince, not of a king. He was shaped to serve in the background. But fate, as it often does, has its own agenda. In 1502, when Henry was just 10 years old, disaster struck the royal family. Arthur, the heir to the throne, died suddenly at the tender age of 15. The cause of Arthur's death was never fully understood, though many speculated it was the result of a fever or a sickness that claimed him in the prime of his youth. One moment, Arthur was alive, preparing for his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King of Spain, a match meant to solidify England's position in European politics. The next, he was dead, leaving behind an unimaginable void in the succession to the throne. The weight of the crown was now forced upon a young boy who was far from ready. Henry, still a child, found himself thrust into a position that was never meant for him. The throne, which had once been a distant dream, was now his to claim. He was no longer just a prince, he was the future king of England. But the burden was terrifying. A 10-year-old boy, grieving the loss of his brother, suddenly had to prepare to lead an entire nation. There was no guide, no protector, only his father, Henry VII, who, though capable, was distant and absorbed in securing his reign. At just 10 years old, Henry was thrust into a position of unimaginable pressure and responsibility. His family, his mother, his father, had raised him to be a second son, and suddenly he was to take the crown meant for his brother. This wasn't just about royal titles or power. This was about life and death. Every decision Henry made would shape the future of his kingdom, and he was far too young, far too inexperienced, to understand the full weight of that responsibility. By 1509, when Henry was just 17 years old, his father, Henry VII, passed away, and the crown passed to the young king. Henry VIII, now 17, found himself not only a monarch but also a man. His youth and his exuberance were to be his greatest weapons. The young king was handsome, charismatic, and filled with ambition. He exuded confidence, leading his court with a vibrant energy that had been absent during his father's reign. His early years as king were marked by celebration, lavish feasts, and the display of royal power that seemed to promise an era of peace and prosperity. England was watching, and the world was waiting. At first, Henry VIII was everything his people could have hoped for, a young, strong king who seemed ready to lead them into a golden age. The early years of his reign were full of promise. He was intelligent, well-educated, and a man of the Renaissance, a king who appreciated art, music, and the complexities of governance. His court was filled with intellectuals, poets, musicians, and artists, and Henry himself was a patron of the arts, encouraging the talents of the age. The future was bright. England seemed to be in the hands of a king who would not just survive but thrive. But this youthful vigor and bright future were a facade, a mask that hid the deeper, darker struggles brewing beneath the surface. Behind the king's smile and the grandeur of his court was a man whose desires for love, power, and legacy would come to consume him. His reign was not to be defined by diplomacy and peace but by betrayal, broken promises, and bloody decisions that would leave a trail of destruction across England and Europe. As the years went on, Henry VIII's obsession with securing his legacy grew. What had once been a nation of hope and expectation began to show cracks. Henry's deep-seated need for a male heir, someone to continue his dynasty, became an obsession. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, though initially full of love and hope, soon turned into a tragic story of failed promises. Catherine, his first wife, could not provide him with the son he so desperately wanted. After more than 2 decades of marriage, the king's frustration reached a breaking point. His obsession with securing a male heir took him down a path that would tear his kingdom apart. This desperation for an heir would lead Henry VIII to make a decision that would shock the world. He would break from the Catholic Church, defy the Pope, and create a new church, one where he was the supreme ruler. This was not just a religious revolution, it was a political one. In doing so, he would not only defy centuries of tradition but also alienate entire countries and families. The very fabric of English society would be torn asunder, and the ripples of this decision would resonate throughout Europe, leading to centuries of religious and political conflict. But the story doesn't end there. Behind Henry's desire for an heir was a darker, more dangerous need: the desire for control. His marriages, his ruthless treatment of his wives, and his executions of those who dared to defy him would come to define his reign. His later years were marked by paranoia, fear, and mental decay. The man who once seemed so full of hope and ambition became a tyrant whose actions would forever change the course of English history. What drove Henry to such extremes? Was it merely the desire for power? Or was there something deeper? A fear of being forgotten? A fear that without a male heir, his legacy would disappear into the annals of history? In the end, Henry VIII did not just break from the church or his marriages, he broke England itself. Stay with me, because the story you're about to hear is far from over. The tale of Henry VIII is not just the story of a king. It's the story of a man whose actions would shake the very foundation of his kingdom and change the course of history. What happens next is nothing short of extraordinary, and you won't want to miss it. Keep watching, because this is just the beginning of the shocking, tragic, and ultimately transformative story of Henry VIII. Henry VIII, in his youth, was everything a king should be: handsome, athletic, and charismatic. His presence could fill a room, and his confidence radiated. He wasn't just a monarch, he was a symbol of power, strength, and vitality. When he first ascended to the throne, the world looked to him with admiration. He was a Renaissance king, full of promise, the perfect embodiment of a ruler who would lead England into greatness. But behind the royal facade, there was something brewing, something far darker. Henry VIII wasn't just a man of charm and youthful vigor. He was a man driven by a deep-seated need for control, for dominance, and for a legacy that could not be erased by time. He was not content with merely being king. He wanted to be remembered forever. And that drive for immortality would soon begin to change him. In the beginning, Henry was the picture of health. He stood tall. His broad shoulders filled out his armor with power and grace. His bright eyes and strong jawline made him the epitome of a young king on a golden throne. He was adored by his people, and his charm made him irresistible to women. He reveled in the attention, the admiration, and the praise. He was, after all, England's Night King, a warrior, a lover, a man of action. But as time went on, something began to shift. It wasn't just the passage of years, it was something far more subtle, more insidious. By 1536, everything began to unravel. Henry's body, once a symbol of vitality, began to betray him. It started with a brutal accident that would forever change the course of his reign. Henry was thrown from his horse during a joust in 1536. A traumatic event that would leave deep physical and emotional scars. He was unconscious for hours, and when he awoke, the world around him had changed. His body, once agile and strong, was never the same. His injuries didn't just affect his physical health, they cracked something deeper inside him. Something that would slowly chip away at the king's once unshakable resolve. The pain of that injury lingered long after his wounds healed, and it left Henry a different man, a man who had become quick to anger, easily frustrated, and increasingly paranoid. No longer the vibrant, confident king, he was now a monarch whose every movement seemed to carry the weight of his body's betrayal. The accident had altered him. The temperamental, volatile king who emerged from his recovery was no longer the young and hopeful ruler who had once been full of life and ambition. Henry's once infectious energy was replaced with bursts of fury, and a sense of impending doom clung to him like a shadow. Those around him, especially his court, felt the change. His advisors, his wives, and his children witnessed the transformation firsthand. The once charismatic and beloved king was now a man driven by an obsession with power and a growing bitterness that no one could escape. But it wasn't just the accident that altered Henry. The years took their toll. His once athletic frame, which had once been the subject of admiration, began to show signs of deterioration. The king, who had once been known for his great physical prowess, now found himself battling with obesity, a condition that would worsen with age. His passion for food, lavish feasts, and indulgence had turned against him. He became a shadow of the man he once was, his body bloated, his face reddened, his movements slower and more labored. What had once been a proud and powerful king now struggled to move. His once sharp mind dulled by pain and physical discomfort. The man who had once danced and jousted, whose body had been the envy of courts across Europe, was now a king whose very form seemed to reflect the inner turmoil he was enduring. His personal health was in constant decline. The king who had once commanded respect with the strength of his presence now commanded fear. His temper flaring with greater frequency and his body betraying him in the most visible way. Yet, as his physical form withered, Henry's internal struggles only grew more intense. His body was failing him, but his ego remained as vast as ever. He was a king who had been brought up to believe that nothing could stand in his way. But now, Every breath he took seemed to remind him of his mortality. His body had become a prison, and within its walls, he fought a constant battle for dominance, against age, against his own body, and against the ever-present fear that his legacy would be lost to time. But what does a king do when his own body betrays him? When the mirror no longer reflects the image of the man he once was? How does he cope with the realization that his power, his strength, is slipping away? Henry's solution was to become even more ruthless, more obsessive. He couldn't control his body, but he could control everything else. His temper grew fiercer, and his need for control became all-consuming. Every decision he made, from his marriages to his execution of close advisors, became a reflection of the battle he was losing within himself. He was a king, but he was also a man who felt the sting of time, the weight of his own body, and the pressure to secure a legacy. The charming, athletic king who had once stood as the embodiment of youthful vitality was now a broken, paranoid monarch who struggled not just with his health, but with the realization that he could never outrun the one thing that could defeat him: time. And so, as Henry VIII's body grew weaker, his mind grew sharper in its desperation. His actions became more erratic, and his decisions, once the product of a powerful, dynamic mind, were now fueled by something darker: the rage, the frustration, the growing sense of impotence. These were the emotions that now defined Henry VIII, and they would lead him to make some of the most shocking and controversial decisions in the history of England. Behind the mask of a king who once had the world at his feet was a man who had been shattered by his own body, and the result was a reign that would go down in history, not just for its grandeur, but for the emotional turmoil that Henry VIII endured every single day. The man who once inspired admiration now instilled fear, and the kingdom that Henry VIII had once ruled with such vitality was now caught in the wake of a king whose life had been defined by his struggles, his pain, and his need to dominate, not just his people, but the very force that had once made him a god in their eyes: his own body. The transformation of Henry VIII was not just physical, it was the story of a man who, in his desperation, changed the world, but in the process, he changed himself in ways that no one could have predicted. 6 tragic marriages of Henry VIII. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, a love built on duty, crushed by uncertainty. In 1509, young Henry VIII, a 17-year-old king full of ambition and energy, married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Their marriage was seen as the union of two powerful nations, a political alliance that promised to cement Henry's reign. For Catherine, however, the marriage was not just a political contract, it was a second chance at love. She had already been widowed once, having been married to Henry's brother, Arthur, who died young. She had known loss, and now, with Henry, she hoped to create a legacy of her own. But what began as a union of hope, faith, and mutual respect would soon falter under the weight of Henry's growing obsession with a male heir. Henry, filled with youthful promise, had expected their marriage to be a blissful journey toward a glorious future. Catherine, dutiful and loyal, threw herself into her role as queen, devoutly trying to fulfill Henry's greatest wish, a son. Their early years together were filled with passion, tenderness, and a shared vision for England's prosperity. But as the years passed and Catherine failed to provide a male heir, their bond began to fray. The love that once flourished began to wither as Henry's desperation grew. Catherine gave Henry a daughter, Mary, a girl who would later become queen. But in the world of royal dynasties, a girl was never enough. Henry's frustration was palpable, his desires consuming him. His desperation was not just personal, it was political. The fate of England's future rested on the birth of a son, and Catherine's failure to deliver one became a symbol of everything he feared, his legacy slipping through his fingers. The pain in Catherine's heart was not just the heartache of a wife betrayed by her husband's growing indifference. It was the soul-crushing realization that her body, once the symbol of life and hope, had failed her. She had given Henry everything, yet it was never enough. The bond that once united them now felt like a distant memory. Henry's gaze turned to another woman, Anne Boleyn, someone who promised him what Catherine could not. In the ultimate act of betrayal, Henry sought an annulment, questioning the validity of their marriage and accusing Catherine of sin. For Catherine, the annulment was not just an affront to her marriage but a personal blow to her identity. She was a queen, and in her heart, she remained the true Queen of England. Despite Henry's rejection, she never relented. She refused to call him anything but her husband. Her heart broke slowly, piece by piece, as she was pushed aside. But her dignity remained intact. Catherine died in 1536, still calling herself the rightful queen. Exiled from the court, rejected by the man she had once loved, her life had been built on love and duty. But in the end, her greatest love had crumbled under the weight of Henry's insatiable thirst for power. Anne Boleyn, the second wife, a queen lost to the king's desires. Anne Boleyn entered Henry's life like a whirlwind, an ambitious woman full of fire, wit, and intelligence. When Henry's eyes turned to her, she represented everything he desired: youth, beauty, and, above all, the hope for a male heir. Unlike Catherine, Anne refused to submit quietly to Henry's will. She challenged him, intrigued him, and ultimately captivated him in ways that no woman ever had before. For Anne, their affair was a chance at power, a chance to change the course of history. Henry's desire for her was intoxicating, and her own ambitions seemed to match his. Their relationship, full of passionate desire, ignited not just Henry's heart but a political revolution. Their love affair became public, scandalous, and led to a break from the Catholic Church. In 1533, Henry married Anne in secret, and she was crowned queen. At first, everything seemed perfect. Anne was everything Henry had dreamed of: powerful, intelligent, and capable of providing him with the son he so desperately needed. But as the years went by, Anne's failure to produce a male heir became her downfall. She gave birth to Elizabeth, a girl who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But Henry, despite his love for Elizabeth, saw Anne's failure as the ultimate betrayal. Anne's life was full of passion, ambition, and hope, but those dreams would be shattered. In 1536, just 3 years after their marriage, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. These charges were widely believed to be fabricated to remove her from the throne. The king who had once adored her now turned against her, and in the blink of an eye, Anne was condemned to death. She was beheaded, her life cut short by the very man who had once loved her with all his heart. Anne Boleyn's tragic death marked the end of a woman who had dared to challenge the king. She had loved him deeply, fought for him, and provided him with Elizabeth, a daughter who would change the fate of England. Her death, a brutal end to a promising life, was a consequence of her failure to give Henry the son he so desperately craved. Yet, in her death, she left behind a legacy that would live on through Elizabeth. A daughter who would rule England with unmatched wisdom and strength. Jane Seymour, the third wife, a promise fulfilled, but a life cut short. After Anne's death, Henry was devastated. He had lost the woman he loved, and his need for a son was still unfulfilled. Enter Jane Seymour, a woman whose quiet beauty and gentle nature would bring Henry both the triumph he so desperately wanted and the heartbreak he could never escape. Jane was different from Anne. She was a woman who sought neither power nor glory but simply sought to please her king. She promised Henry the one thing he desired more than anything: an heir. And in 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward VI, the son Henry had longed for. It was a moment of pure joy for Henry, a moment of victory. The long-awaited male heir had arrived, and with it, the hope for the future of the Tudor dynasty. But fate, cruel and unforgiving, had other plans. Just days after giving birth to Edward, Jane died from complications related to childbirth. Henry was shattered. Jane had given him the one thing he desired above all else, a son, and yet, in the same breath, he had lost her. The grief was unlike anything Henry had felt before. For all the women who had come before her, Jane was the only one he truly mourned. Her death marked the end of Henry's hope for peace. The son he had longed for came at the cost of the woman who had made it possible. His joy at having a son was forever tainted by the loss of Jane. For Henry, it was a reminder that life, no matter how carefully planned, could not always be controlled. Anne of Cleves. The fourth wife, a marriage of convenience. A marriage ended. In 1540, after years of heartache and loss, Henry sought another bride, Anne of Cleves, a German princess whom he had never met in person. Their marriage was an alliance, a political arrangement designed to strengthen England's position in Europe. Henry had been shown portraits of Anne and, thinking her beautiful, agreed to marry her. But when Anne arrived in England, Henry was horrified. She was not at all what he had imagined. She was not beautiful in his eyes, and the passion he had hoped for was absent. He could not bring himself to consummate the marriage, and within days, he sought an annulment. Anne, for her part, accepted the annulment graciously. She understood that her marriage to Henry had never been about love, it was about politics. Despite the humiliating annulment, Anne of Cleves was treated with kindness after the divorce. She was given a generous settlement and allowed to live in England. She and Henry even remained on good terms, a rarity in Henry's history of broken marriages. Yet, Anne's marriage to Henry was one of the most disastrous and short-lived in history. Catherine Howard. The fifth wife, a life of youth, and a death of betrayal. In 1540, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a young, passionate woman who seemed to embody everything Henry desired. She was youthful, full of life, and full of potential. Yet, her marriage to Henry, who was now aging and in declining health, would end in tragedy. Catherine, like Anne Boleyn before her, found herself caught up in a court filled with intrigue and temptation. Despite her marriage to Henry, she was rumored to have had affairs with other men, including her cousin Thomas Culpeper. When the truth came to light, Henry was devastated, his heartbreak turned to rage, and Catherine was arrested, charged with adultery, and executed by beheading. Her death marked yet another sad chapter in Henry's life. Once again, he was left with nothing but the wreckage of a broken heart. Catherine's death was a reflection of Henry's increasing paranoia, obsession with loyalty, and growing disillusionment with the women around him. Catherine Parr. The sixth wife, the caretaker, the survivor. In 1543, Henry married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, a woman who would not bear him any more children but who would become the steadying force Henry needed in his final years. Catherine was strong, intelligent, and capable. Unlike Henry's previous wives, Catherine entered his life as a caretaker, not to produce an heir, but to help manage his declining health and navigate the complexities of his court. Their marriage was not without its struggles, but Catherine proved to be a steadying influence. She helped care for Henry's children, held the court together, and provided him with the peace and comfort he needed in his final years. Catherine outlived Henry, surviving his death in 1547. She would go on to marry again, but her role in Henry's life was crucial. She helped navigate the decline of his reign with dignity, becoming the woman who brought stability to his final years. Conclusion. The six wives of Henry VIII. The six marriages of Henry VIII were more than just romantic relationships. They were the defining moments of his reign. His wives, each in their own way, shaped his legacy, and their fates were intertwined with his own. They were the women who bore his hopes, his frustrations, and ultimately his despair. For Henry, love was never enough. His relationships were not just about companionship, they were about power, legacy, and the unyielding need for control. And in his pursuit of power, he destroyed the very women who had once loved him, ultimately leaving behind a legacy marked by heartbreak, betrayal, and a never-ending quest for an heir who could carry his name forward. Each of Henry's marriages tells a story of hope, ambition, love, and ultimately, tragedy. These women, once so close to the throne, were discarded and betrayed in ways that are still felt today. And in the end, it was not just the blood of his wives that was shed, but the blood of his own dynasty. The break with the Catholic Church and the birth of the Church of England. The reason for the break: the king's obsession and the desperate need for control. The sun set on the opulent halls of Whitehall Palace as Henry VIII, the young king full of vigor and promise, sat in his chambers, alone with his thoughts. His once youthful ambition had now turned into an obsession, a need so desperate, so consuming, it gnawed at his very soul. For years, his relationship with Catherine of Aragon had been built on duty, respect, and shared visions of prosperity. But as the years passed and Catherine's inability to provide him with a male heir became more apparent, Henry's desperation began to manifest itself in ways that could no longer be ignored. His once golden marriage now felt like a trap, an unbreakable chain that bound him to failure. Catherine, a woman of grace, intellect, and unwavering loyalty, could no longer provide him with what he needed most: a son to secure the Tudor legacy. His mind became consumed with doubt. Each year that passed without a son was a year wasted, a year where the possibility of England's future, its stability, and its survival seemed to slip further from his grasp. Henry's mind, once sharp and clear, began to turn with dark thoughts. His very identity as king was now at stake. What would he be remembered for? A dynasty without heirs, a ruler who failed to secure his kingdom's future. His desire for a male heir was no longer just a wish, it became a compulsion, an obsession that could not be sated by mere love or duty. And so, when Henry's eyes fell upon Anne Boleyn, a woman whose spirit matched his own, who promised him what Catherine could not, he found himself torn between the chains of his marriage and the seductive promise of a future with Anne. She was vibrant, powerful, and, above all, capable of providing him with the son he so desperately craved. But this passion came at a cost, one Henry had not fully understood. For Anne's love would ignite a storm that would change not only the course of England's history but the fate of the Catholic Church itself. Henry was a man used to getting what he wanted. But this time, it was different. Anne Boleyn was more than a mistress. She was the key to everything he had ever dreamed of. She was his path to power. And to create the future he envisioned, Henry would have to break everything in his past. The creation of the Church of England, the ultimate act of defiance. The Pope's refusal to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine was not just a religious disagreement, it was a personal affront to Henry's authority. The Catholic Church, an institution that had once been intertwined with the monarchy, now stood as an obstacle to the king's desires. For the first time in his life, Henry VIII was defied by someone who had once been in his service. His fear grew into rage, and that rage birthed one of the most radical acts of defiance ever seen in history. In 1534, Henry VIII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing centuries of religious ties with Rome. This moment was more than just a religious schism, it was a personal revolution. A statement of power, defiance, and an unrelenting need for control. No longer would Henry be subject to the authority of the Pope. His kingdom would be his alone, and the only thing that mattered was his ability to shape its destiny. The consequences of this break were not immediate, they were slow burning. At first, Henry's move was hailed by his supporters as a victory for national sovereignty. But as the ramifications of his actions set in, England was plunged into religious turmoil. Henry's decision to dissolve the monasteries and seize their wealth and land not only financially empowered the crown but decimated centuries-old institutions that had cared for the poor, the sick, and the needy. For the poor, the loss of monastic charity was devastating. The dissolution of the monasteries created a void that could not be easily filled. The peasantry, who had once relied on the church for education and sustenance, found themselves abandoned in a society now ruled by fear and suspicion. Henry's personal ambition had not only broken his marriage to Catherine, it had torn at the very fabric of English society. And Henry, now at the pinnacle of his power, found himself surrounded by enemies, both internal and external. The Catholic world, scandalized by his actions, began to look at England with suspicion, and foreign powers, including France and Spain, sought to undermine Henry's position. The break from Rome, though initially empowering, would soon lead to struggles that would shape England's future for generations. The impact on English society, the kingdom in turmoil. As Henry's rule took on a new religious dimension, the effects on the lives of ordinary Englishmen and women were devastating. The very soul of England was being torn apart by the king's decisions. The Catholic Mass, the sacraments, the familiar prayers, gone. The stability that had once come from Rome now felt like a distant memory. The severing of religious ties led to widespread confusion among the people, leaving them caught between the old and the new. England was now divided between those who remained loyal to the Pope and those who had embraced Henry's new church. Loyalty became a matter of life and death. Those who refused to swear allegiance to the Church of England faced execution. The burning of heretics, both Catholic and Protestant, marked a period of religious persecution and brutal repression. Men and women, once safe under the banner of faith, were now at risk of losing their lives for a mere word spoken or a prayer not in line with Henry's new vision for England. And yet, Henry's decisions, though born out of desperation, obsession, and power, would ultimately solidify his reign. The Church of England, though born in anger and frustration, would go on to become an enduring institution, one that defined the English identity for centuries. Henry had remade religion to suit his needs, but he had also ensured that no matter the cost, England would never be the same. The consequences: a kingdom divided and a king consumed. In the years that followed, Henry's actions began to take their toll on him, not just physically, but mentally. The burden of his decisions, the isolation he felt from the rest of Europe, and the constant suspicion in his own court began to eat away at his spirit. The man who had once been filled with energy and passion had become a king consumed by fear, regret, and paranoia. His marriages, his break with Rome, and his quest for a male heir had all been driven by fear that without a son, his legacy would crumble, that his place in history would be erased. But the cost of that fear had been greater than he could have imagined. His personal desires had led to the dissolution of a nation's soul, leaving England torn, bruised, and divided. As Henry's physical health deteriorated, so too did his mental state. The once brilliant king, who had led England with vigor and charm, was now a shadow of himself, consumed by guilt and paranoia. He had created a new church, but in doing so, he had also created a nation divided against itself. He had broken his marriage vows, but in the end, it was his own heart that had been broken. Henry's legacy was one of power, but it was also one of heartache and loss. The crown he had fought so hard to protect had become a prison, and his desire for control had left him isolated and alone. His break with the Catholic Church had been a bold act of defiance, but it had also shattered the kingdom he had vowed to protect. Conclusion: the king who would shape England, and the price he would pay. Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church was not just a moment in history, it was a shattering of faith, a rebirth of power, and the ultimate personal cost. In seeking to control his legacy, Henry had changed the face of England forever. The creation of the Church of England marked a new chapter in English history, one that would define the nation's future for centuries. But in that pursuit of control, Henry had alienated not just his people, but himself. What began as a fight for power and legacy would ultimately consume Henry. His story is a tragic one, a tale of a man so obsessed with creating his own future that he destroyed everything he once held dear. The Church of England may have endured, but it was built on the bones of betrayal, and that betrayal would haunt Henry VIII until the end of his days. In the end, Henry's break with Rome was not just a political act, it was a tragic decision that would shape not just a kingdom, but a man's very soul. The price of Henry's quest for control was higher than he could ever have imagined. His legacy, born of power and pain, would echo through history, a reminder of the cost of ambition and the price of a kingdom's soul. Domestic and foreign policies of Henry VIII. Domestic policy. Strengthening monarchical power through authority and wealth. Henry VIII, when he first took the throne, was not content to simply inherit the power his father had left him. He had ambitious dreams of transforming the monarchy into an absolute powerhouse that not only commanded respect but also had the means to secure its legacy for generations to come. This was not just about ruling a kingdom. Henry wanted to reshape the very fabric of England. His first major domestic act, the dissolution of the monasteries, was, on the surface, a pragmatic political decision designed to reduce the power of the Catholic Church in England. But as the monasteries were stripped of their wealth, and the lands passed into Henry's hands, a deeper, more personal agenda began to unfold. Henry was seizing control, not just over land, but over the soul of England. No longer would he be beholden to Rome, nor would the Church have any power to challenge his authority. Henry's royal ambition was unmistakable, but it came with a devastating cost. The monasteries had provided education, shelter, food, and charity for the poor. The dissolution left thousands of common people in the dust, their livelihoods stripped away by a king who had promised glory but delivered devastation. The poor, who once had hope in the institutions of the Church, now faced nothing but uncertainty and suffering. This created a stark contrast between the royal court, now flush with the wealth and land of the Church, and the desperate conditions faced by the common folk. Henry, surrounded by the nobility he had rewarded with new lands, basked in his newfound power. But the cost to England's soul was becoming evident. The crown grew wealthier, but the kingdom became fractured. Loyalty to the monarch was secured through fear, not love, and the new nobility was constantly walking a tightrope, knowing their wealth was entirely dependent on Henry's favor. The nobility and power struggles. Henry's centralization of power created a kingdom where trust was a luxury. Loyalty was not earned, it was bought. It was a world where betrayal became an everyday part of life, where any misstep could cost you not only your land but your life. The nobility, now enriched by their newfound lands, were constantly vying for Henry's favor, but they also had to walk a precarious line. One wrong move, one hint of disobedience, and they could easily find themselves executed or disgraced. Henry's reign was one of fear, paranoia, and constant scheming. Those in his court could never be sure if they would be rewarded for their loyalty or thrown to the wolves the next day. The shift from loyalty to fear within the royal circle created a kingdom where alliances were constantly changing, and betrayal was just around the corner. At the same time, Henry's obsession with securing the Tudor dynasty began to weigh heavily on the royal court, as well as on the common people. As Henry's need for a male heir became all-consuming, he found himself abandoning alliances and sacrificing relationships to achieve his goal. Foreign policy. Wars with France and Scotland, a kingdom drained. Henry's thirst for glory and military conquest extended far beyond England's borders. France and Scotland, longtime rivals, were seen as the key to cementing his place in European history. Victory in battle was the ultimate test of royal power, and Henry, emboldened by his early successes, sought to make England the dominant military power in Europe. In 1512, Henry launched a campaign in France, aligning himself with Spain against the French. The war was costly, but Henry believed it would secure England's place as a European superpower. However, the conflict turned out to be a fool's errand. The costs were astronomical, and England gained little in return. The English soldiers fought valiantly, but Henry's failure to capitalize on military success exposed a gap between his ambition and reality. The military campaigns drained the treasury, and after a few years, Henry was forced to sign a peace treaty with France. leaving England empty-handed. Yet, despite the crushing failure, Henry persisted. He convinced himself that the war had been worth it. His desire for glory was insatiable, and this internal need for validation pushed him to continue engaging in costly and fruitless wars. It was no longer about conquering land, it was about securing his legacy. The French and Scottish conflict. A web of deceit and miscalculations. In 1544, Henry renewed his war against France, yet again, with the hope of making England the preeminent European power. Once more, he launched military expeditions into France. But this time, the French were ready. Instead of the quick victory Henry expected, he faced stiff resistance. France was no longer the weak, fragmented country it once was. The French king, Francis I, had rallied his forces and fortified his land. The English were defeated once again, and Henry's attempts to secure glory on the battlefield became increasingly futile. The cost of these wars was not just financial, it drained England's morale. Noble families were losing sons in these distant battles, and the kingdom itself was left questioning the wisdom of Henry's decisions. Meanwhile, Scotland remained a thorn in England's side. In 1513, Henry invaded Scotland with the hope of weakening its alliance with France. The Battle of Flodden resulted in victory for England, but it came at a cost. Scotland's future was left in turmoil after the battle, and Henry did little to secure long-term peace. By 1542, Scotland had renewed its alliance with France, and Henry once again found himself embroiled in a war that would lead to no decisive victory. These wars, costly and draining, did little to secure Henry's long-term goals. The paradox of Henry's foreign policy was that it was driven by a king obsessed with glory but without the strategic foresight to secure lasting peace. His decisions were impulsive, driven by pride and desperation, and the legacy of his military campaigns was not one of triumph, but of failed conquests and drained resources. The psychological toll, paranoia, guilt, and regret, the constant warfare, the betrayal, the impossible demands for an heir, it all began to take its toll on Henry. Once a young, charismatic ruler, he was now a king who had lost his vigor. Paranoia became his constant companion. He feared betrayal at every corner, and his temper grew volatile. He turned on his trusted advisors, executing or exiling those who had once been close allies. Henry's legacy of violence not only took a toll on his body but also on his soul. The king who had once seemed invincible now began to doubt himself. Each decision was clouded by fear of failure, and each failed war, each unfulfilled promise, left him with a sense of regret that he could not escape. As he grew older and weaker, Henry looked back on his life, his reign, and the legacy he had created. His empire was rich in land, wealth, and titles, but it was fragile. His kingdom was divided, his people restless, and the royal family, once the symbol of England's power, was fractured by a series of marriages that had left him emotionally broken. Conclusion. The price of power. Henry VIII's reign was defined by his relentless quest for power, control, and glory. His foreign wars, though initially promising, had drained his kingdom's resources and morale. His internal policies, while securing his place in history, left the common people isolated and impoverished. Henry, in his pursuit of legacy, had sacrificed everything: his health, his relationships, his people, all for the illusion of immortality through conquest. The legacy he left behind was one of both grandeur and despair. His kingdom was stronger than ever, but it was built on a foundation of violence, betrayal, and personal insecurity. His foreign policy may have been driven by pride, but in the end, it was a tale of lost opportunities and a ruler who could never escape the ghosts of his own ambitions. Henry VIII's reign ended not with the glory he sought but with a kingdom forever altered, divided, weakened, and scarred by the very decisions he had made in his pursuit of power. The legacy he sought to create was shattered, not by external forces, but by his own hand. And in his final days, He must have realized that the cost of his greatness was far greater than he ever could have imagined. Henry VIII and the role in the European Reformation. The Religious Reformation. A king's desperate gambit for power. The year was 1534, and Henry VIII stood in the solitude of his chambers, hands clenched in frustration as he gazed upon the symbol of the Pope's rejection, a letter from Rome refusing to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. His life had been a tangled web of frustration and desire, a constant push against the tide of fate. Catherine, whom he had once adored, had given him everything but the one thing that haunted his dreams, a male heir. Henry's desperation had long since transcended mere political necessity. His fear of England's future without a male heir consumed him. His dynasty, his legacy, everything he thought he had built, was now at risk. This fear had driven him into the arms of Anne Boleyn, and the emotional toll of this affair weighed heavily on him. He loved Anne, yes, but it was more than love, it was the hope of a future. A future he could not see without a son. In the silence of his chambers, Henry grappled with the monumental decision that lay before him. If he defied the Pope, it was not just a betrayal of the Catholic Church, it was a betrayal of the very faith that had defined him as a king. The path he would take was unprecedented, a choice that would shape the fate of England for centuries. But could he risk his eternal soul? Was it worth damning himself for the sake of power and the Tudor legacy? The truth weighed heavily on him. He was not only battling the Catholic Church, but he was battling his own conscience, his own faith. In the end, his fear of losing everything to a legacy without a male heir overwhelmed his doubts. Catherine's refusal to acknowledge his power in this matter had struck him to his core. He had no choice but to sever ties with Rome. In 1534, Henry VIII declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. A move that would irrevocably change not just England, but the course of Christianity across the world. But was it power he sought? Or was it the desperation of a man unwilling to allow his legacy to crumble beneath his feet? Creating the Church of England, a legacy born of desperation. Henry's decision to create a church separate from Rome was calculated but also desperate. He wanted a male heir, but more than that, he wanted to control his fate. His break with Rome was not simply about religion, it was about control, power, and the desire to shape his legacy on his own terms. He saw himself as a monarch above all others, one whose authority could not be questioned by any institution, not even the Pope, as Henry formally declared himself as the head of the Church of England. It was not a proclamation of faith, it was a declaration of dominance. He held the power of both the sword and the spirit, an unparalleled concentration of influence over his subjects and their religious practices. But this power came at a great cost. He was now locked in a bitter struggle. Not just with the Pope, but with God. Was he the true leader of the English people? Or was he simply a man consumed by pride and fear? Henry's church was not a church of reform. It was a church created out of sheer necessity to legitimize his actions. His policies were driven by a deep insecurity, the belief that without a male heir, the Tudor dynasty would fall apart. And so, in a series of political and religious maneuvers, he broke the chains that had tied England to Rome for centuries. England was now free. But was Henry truly free? Or was he trapped by the very power he sought to control? The impact on the people, the shattered foundations of faith, the dissolution of the monasteries was the most devastating blow to England's spiritual heart. Thousands of people who had once relied on the charitable works of the Catholic Church found themselves without help, support, or comfort. The poor, the sick, and the needy were abandoned, left to fend for themselves in a kingdom where religion was no longer a moral guide, but a political tool. It was here that the true emotional cost of Henry's decision became evident. Monasteries, the centers of learning, charity, and sanctuary, were torn apart, their lands seized by the crown, their wealth redistributed to the growing power of the nobility. What was once a world where the church served the common people was now a world where faith was manipulated for the crown's gain. Henry, in his desire for control, had destroyed the very fabric of society that had held England together for centuries. The bitter irony was that while Henry grew stronger, England's soul grew weaker. The poor were left to starve. The faithful were left without guidance, wondering how the very institution that had sustained them for centuries could be so easily undone. The English people were divided, not just by politics, but by spiritual trauma, and Henry, the king who had once stood as a protector of faith, was now seen by many as the man who had betrayed them. The rise of Protestantism, Henry's unintended legacy. While Henry VIII's personal faith never aligned with the Protestant Reformation, his break from the Catholic Church became an unintended catalyst for the Protestant movement in England. Henry's creation of the Church of England, while deeply rooted in his own personal desires, opened the door for Protestant ideas to take root in a way that no papal authority could ever stop. As Lutheran and Reformed ideas began to infiltrate England, the Church of England became the vehicle through which these ideas could spread. Figures like Thomas Cranmer, William Tyndale, and others began to push forward the Protestant agenda, challenging Catholic doctrine and practices. What Henry had begun as a political necessity had now evolved into a religious revolution, one that would sweep across Europe and change the course of history forever. Henry had intended for his church to serve as a means of securing his dynasty, not as a tool for reform, but by breaking with Rome, he had opened the door for reformers who would reshape the landscape of Christianity in England and beyond. And although Henry never fully embraced Protestantism, he had created an environment that would make it impossible to suppress. The Protestant Reformation had found its way into England, and there was no turning back. Henry VIII's unintended role in the European Reformation. Henry VIII, the reluctant reformer, did not intend to be the architect of Protestantism in England. His personal belief system remained steadfastly Catholic, even as he created a church that would eventually embrace Protestant theology. But in his decision to break from the Catholic Church, he had inadvertently become a central figure in the religious upheaval sweeping across Europe. His move to establish the Church of England opened the floodgates for the spread of Protestant ideas, leading to a religious divide that would not only alter the course of English history but also shape the fate of Europe itself. England, once a staunch defender of Catholicism, now became one of the most influential Protestant nations in Europe, leading the charge for reform and religious independence. Henry's reign, therefore, was a paradox. On one hand, he was a king whose actions were driven by personal ambition and fear, the desire to secure his dynasty. On the other hand, he became an unintended catalyst for the Protestant Reformation, changing the course of both England and Europe. Conclusion. Henry VIII, the reluctant architect of Reformation. Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church marked the beginning of a religious revolution that would forever alter the course of history. Though his motivations were personal, his actions opened the door for the Protestant Reformation to take root in England. Henry's role in this transformation was unintentional, yet his break with Rome was the spark that ignited a religious firestorm across Europe. While Henry may not have intended to create a Protestant England, his legacy became intertwined with the rise of Protestantism, shaping both his nation and the broader Christian world. His church, though born out of political necessity, became a foundation for the religious changes that would ripple through the centuries, leaving Henry VIII forever marked as a key figure in the European Reformation. The decline of Henry VIII, the fall of a king. The physical and mental breakdown of Henry VIII. Henry VIII, once the picture of youthful vigor and majestic power, had been reduced, by the end of his life, to a broken man, both physically and mentally. In the early days of his reign, he was known for his athleticism, energy, and formidable presence. His regal strength had been a symbol of the Tudor dynasty and the future of England. But as he aged, the very qualities that had defined him turned into reminders of his decline. His body betrayed him, and his mind followed soon after. The physical toll. A king's body in ruins. In his later years, Henry's once immense stature had shrunk under the weight of obesity and gout. His gout, which had started as an occasional discomfort, now crippled him. His legs swelled to painful proportions, rendering him almost immobile. Once a proud jousting champion, the man who had once galloped through the fields with pride could no longer even sit comfortably, much less participate in the tournaments that had once been his favorite pastime. His body became a prison. The king whose sword had once commanded the field was now hopeless, his dignity a memory fading with each passing year. But it wasn't just his physical health that deteriorated. His wounds and the complications from his injuries also began to take a heavy toll on his mental state. His famous jousting accident of 1536, which left him with a severe leg injury, had never fully healed. The wound festered and grew worse over time, leading to infection and constant pain, which plagued Henry for the rest of his life. The once strong body of the king now appeared more as a sickly shell of what it had been. Limping through his palace, unable to stand for long periods, the sight of Henry stumbling in his old age was a far cry from the majestic monarch who had once walked with strength and command. This physical decay was a metaphor for the psychological collapse that followed. The staggering weight of power, once so thrilling, now crushed him with the realization that his body was beyond his control. And even more tragically, his inability to control his physical state mirrored his profound helplessness in matters of the heart and mind. The psychological decline, paranoia, guilt, and emotional isolation. As Henry's physical health deteriorated, so too did his mental state. He was once a man of certainty, a king whose decisions were bold, decisive, and driven by the belief that he was the one true authority in England. But as the years wore on, the king who had once commanded loyalty and fear in his court began to feel the weight of his own decisions more than ever before. Henry's mind, once sharp and focused, became clouded by paranoia, guilt, and an unrelenting fear of betrayal. The most profound change in Henry's psychological state occurred after the execution of Anne Boleyn. Anne, the woman he had once loved with passionate intensity, was now dead at his own command. In 1536, when Anne was executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, it marked the beginning of a downward spiral in Henry's psyche. He had been the one to accuse her, the one to make the decision to send her to the executioner's block. Yet her death left him feeling not triumphant, but empty. In the years following Anne's death, Henry became increasingly unpredictable and impulsive. His decisions seemed to be driven less by clear judgment and more by the ravages of his mind. He would turn on his closest allies, like Thomas Cromwell, who had once been his trusted advisor but was executed in 1540 due to a perceived failure in managing Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. But it wasn't just political decisions that went wrong. Henry's emotional distrust permeated every part of his life. The king, surrounded by a court full of sycophants and yes-men, had become isolated in his own kingdom. His once energetic and commanding presence had been replaced by a suspicious, erratic ruler. Trust was a currency that Henry could no longer afford, and those who had once been loyal companions were now seen as threats. His wives, too, bore the brunt of this insecurity. His relationship with his children, especially his sons, became strained and distant. Edward VI, his long-desired male heir, was still a young boy, and Henry couldn't help but worry that his fragile legacy would fall apart. The relationship with family, betrayal, isolation, and regret. Henry's relationship with his family during the later years of his reign was a study in betrayal and loss. His emotional connections had been destroyed by fear, paranoia, and a persistent sense of guilt that tainted every relationship he had. With each marriage and subsequent death, Henry's heart became a little more hardened. The love he had once had for Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn was replaced by a bitter resentment that grew as he found himself consumed by regret. His relationship with Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, became strained as well. Elizabeth was a powerful figure, but to Henry, She was the product of the marriage he regretted most. Though he had initially loved Anne, the suspicion and anger Henry felt over her betrayal lingered. He couldn't help but wonder whether Elizabeth would rise above him, become a queen who could surpass the legacy of her father. And then there was Edward VI, Henry's son and the only male heir he had ever desired. But Henry's doubts about Edward's ability to rule were ever present. Edward was only a child, and Henry began to worry about whether his son was strong enough to defend the Tudor dynasty. This uncertainty about Edward's future as king only exacerbated Henry's emotional breakdown. Even Mary I, his daughter by Catherine of Aragon, was not immune to his distrust. Their relationship had always been tense, and by the time of Henry's death, Mary was still a deeply devout Catholic who had experienced the most personal pain during Henry's break from Rome. The religious divide between father and daughter had left an emotional scar, further alienating Henry from his own children. The last years, a king's final moments in isolation. In his final days, Henry was surrounded by sycophants, but he was alone in his mind. His once grand palace at Hampton Court was now a prison for a man consumed by his own fears. He could no longer take comfort in his former strength. He couldn't look to his advisors for counsel, for he distrusted them all. The king who had once ruled with unquestioned authority now found himself without the clarity of vision that had once defined him. There, in the silence of his chambers, the once proud Henry VIII was haunted by his past decisions. His health was failing, his body rotting from within. His mind, once sharp, now clouded by the constant fear of betrayal and regret, led him to an emotional desperation that few would ever fully understand. He began to question everything. The weight of the crown was heavier than ever before. His final days were marked by guilt. Guilt for the men and women he had executed in the name of his throne. Guilt for his own failures as a ruler. His children, his kingdom, even his own legacy were beyond his control. For Henry, the crown no longer felt like a symbol of power but a burden too heavy to bear. The last hours, a king's final regret. As Henry's health continued to deteriorate, his final moments became a tragic reminder of the emotional and physical toll of a life lived in the pursuit of power at all costs. The once great monarch, who had shaped England's future with his ambition, conquest, and will to dominate, found himself lying in a bed of weakness, overwhelmed by the consequences of his own decisions. At the moment of his death, one can only imagine the thoughts that raced through his mind. Was he content with the legacy he had created? Was he at peace with the bloodshed he had caused? Did he die with the belief that he had done what was necessary to preserve his dynasty? Or did he lament the lives he had ruined in the process? Perhaps, in those final moments, Henry realized that the price of power had been too high, that the kingship he had fought so hard to retain had come at the cost of everything he had truly desired: love, family, and peace of mind. His last breath was that of a man who had conquered kingdoms, but who had failed to conquer the demons within himself. Conclusion. The tragic end of Henry VIII. The final days of Henry VIII were marked by fear, regret, and a profound sense of loss. A king who had once been full of life, vigor, and ambition now faced the reality of his own mortality and the weight of a legacy filled with bloodshed, betrayal, and destruction. His reign, once glorious and powerful, ended in isolation. A king who had spent his life building an empire was now left with nothing but the ruins of his own ambition. In the end, Henry VIII's life serves as a reminder of the costs of unchecked power, the toll of ambition, and the emotional collapse that can come from pursuing a legacy at any cost. His death was not just the end of a king. It was the end of a man who had fought against fate, only to be consumed by it in his final years. Henry VIII died as he had lived, a king of contradictions. Powerful, yet vulnerable, feared, yet alone. His legacy, though lasting, was built on a foundation of betrayal, paranoia, and regret. The tragic downfall of Henry VIII was a stark reminder that even the mightiest rulers cannot escape the consequences of their own choices. In the end, power, like life itself, is fleeting, and no amount of wealth, land, or crown can shield a man from the truth of his own soul. The death of Henry VIII and its consequences. The final days of a king. A dying monarch's last struggles. In the dim-lit chambers of Hampton Court Palace, the once great and powerful King Henry VIII lay on his deathbed, surrounded by the silence that only the last moments of life can bring. The jovial king who had once commanded armies and feasted in royal splendor was now a shattered man, whose body had deteriorated beyond recognition. His once powerful legs, shattered from the jousting accident, now lay swollen, and his body was burdened by the gout and obesity that had ravaged him in his later years. The majesty of his earlier life, full of strength and authority, had turned into an agonizing frailty. But it wasn't just his body that had betrayed him, it was his soul. Torn apart by the decisions he had made throughout his reign, the broken marriages, the executions of those closest to him, the paranoia, and the guilt that had haunted him for years all came crashing down in the final days of his life. His mind, once sharp and confident, was now clouded by the decay of time, his thoughts fragmented, plagued by the weight of regret. Henry's regret. A king haunted by his choices. As Henry VIII's life drew to a close, he found himself overwhelmed by a sense of remorse and guilt for the actions he had taken in the name of power. His body, once a symbol of royal strength, had now become a reminder of the tragic consequences of his decisions. His emotional collapse mirrored his physical decline. Henry, in his last moments, had to reckon with the ruins of the life he had built, the bloody executions, the broken marriages, and the betrayals that had left a deep wound in his soul. Most haunting to him was the death of his wives. He had loved Catherine of Aragon once, and though their marriage had been built on duty, she had given him years of devotion. Yet when she failed to give him a male heir, Henry's love for her turned to frustration, then hatred. The execution of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had once ignited his passion, shattered him, though Anne had given him Elizabeth, the daughter who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. Henry was unable to see past her failure to provide him with the son he so desperately sought. Catherine Howard, another young, beautiful woman whom he had married out of desire, was executed when her infidelity was revealed. Each of these women had once been part of his dreams of dynastic survival. And yet all had been discarded, sacrificed in the relentless pursuit of a male heir. In his final days, Henry could not help but wonder, was it worth it? Was the kingdom I built worth the cost of my humanity? His heart was filled with sorrow for the women he had loved and discarded, for the lives lost in the pursuit of his legacy, and for the trust he had destroyed along the way. He had destroyed relationships, destroyed faith, and even destroyed his own peace of mind. The guilt was overwhelming. The man who had once been so certain of his path was now crippled by self-doubt and regret. His final years had been spent trying to justify his decisions to himself. But now, with death knocking at his door, he could no longer hide from the truth. He had sacrificed everything, his own soul, his family, and his kingdom, all for the illusion of power. The weight of it all was unbearable. The deteriorating relationship with his children. One of the most painful aspects of Henry's final years was his relationship with his children. Edward VI, his only surviving son and the heir to the throne, had been a source of hope throughout much of Henry's reign. But in his final days, Henry was gripped by anxiety over his son's ability to rule. Edward, who was just a boy of 9, lacked the maturity and experience needed to govern. The future of the Tudor dynasty, so carefully nurtured by Henry, was now at the mercy of an uncertain child. As Henry lay on his deathbed, he had no certainty about what kind of king Edward would become. Would he be a weak ruler, unable to defend the crown? Would he succumb to the pressures of the court, The very dynasty Henry had spent a lifetime building now seemed fragile and uncertain. The fear that his son would not be able to carry on his work ate away at Henry in his final moments. Henry had wanted a strong son, someone who could inherit his kingdom and continue his legacy. But Edward's youth cast doubt on whether that dream would ever come to fruition. Meanwhile, his daughters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, represented further complications. Mary, the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been a constant reminder of his failed marriage. Their relationship had always been strained, and the religious divide between them created a distance that could never be bridged. Henry had repudiated her mother's Catholicism, and Mary, in turn, was a deeply devout Catholic. Their relationship had always been tense, but now, as Henry's health declined, he feared for England's future under Mary's reign. Would she restore Catholicism? Would her rule bring about a return to violence? These were the questions that haunted Henry in his final days. Elizabeth, his second daughter, was perhaps the most troubling of all. Though she had survived her mother's execution, she had always been shunned by Henry, rejected as a true heir due to the political fallout from her mother. Anne Boleyn's execution. As Henry lay dying, he had no way of knowing whether Elizabeth, the daughter of his greatest love and greatest betrayal, would rise to power as the powerful queen that she would become. For all his attempts to create a male heir, it was Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman he had condemned, who would ultimately succeed him. In his final moments, Henry must have felt a profound sense of loss, not only for his sons, but for his entire family and what it had become. A kingdom once united by blood and ambition was now marked by fractured relationships, unresolved grief, and unanswered questions. The king's final regret. The last moments of Henry VIII. As Henry VIII lay dying, he was no longer the charismatic king who had once commanded the world's attention. The imposing figure of the young monarch, filled with confidence and pride, had long since faded. Now, in his final hours, he was simply an old man, isolated, consumed by guilt, fear, and regret. The last days of his life were spent in a constant state of reflection. Henry knew that his legacy was forever sealed by his actions, actions driven by his obsession with power, his unyielding desire for a male heir, and his fear of what the future might hold for his family. It was a legacy built on violence, betrayal, and paranoia, a legacy that Henry could no longer escape. In his final moments, Henry must have wondered whether it had all been worth it. Had his desire for power led him to ruin not only his body, but his soul? Had he lost everything that truly mattered, his family, his happiness, and his peace of mind, in his quest to secure his place in history? The man who had once been so certain, so sure of his right to rule, now faced the ultimate truth. He had spent his life pursuing an illusion of control. But in the end, it was his own humanity, his love, his fears, and his need for connection that had eluded him. As he drew his final breath, Henry VIII was no longer a king. He was a man who had paid the price for the power he had coveted so dearly. His death marked the end of a reign of ambition, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for England, one that would be defined by his children, by the consequences of his decisions, and by the legacy of his choices. Conclusion. The lasting legacy of a king's choices. Henry VIII's death marked the end of an era, but it also left a legacy that would continue to haunt England for generations. His decisions, though made with the desire for power, had ultimately fractured his family, his faith, and his kingdom. He died as a king of contradictions, once powerful, now broken, once feared, now forgotten, once certain of his purpose, now shackled by his own regret. The price of power, as Henry had learned too late, was not just physical but spiritual. His reign, though filled with triumphs and conquests, was also filled with destruction. And in his final days, he had to face the horrifying truth that the empire he had built had come at too great a cost. The tragedy of Henry VIII's reign lies not only in the decisions he made but in the soul-crushing toll that those decisions took on him and those around him. He was a king who sought immortality. But in the end, he left behind not a legacy of strength and glory, but one of division, suffering, and insecurity. As England moved forward, Henry VIII's name would be remembered as that of a king who built an empire, but also as a man who paid a devastating price for his pursuit of power and control. The legacy and unsolved mysteries of Henry VIII, the emotional turmoil, the king's regret and guilt. In his final days, Henry VIII found himself trapped between the legacy he had created and the haunting consequences of his decisions. The ambitious, charismatic king who once commanded England with unquestioned authority now lay in the quiet solitude of his chambers, consumed by regret, guilt, and a profound sense of loneliness. The toll of his years of ruthless decisions weighed heavily on his heart. As Henry's body deteriorated, so did his mind. The fear of death was no longer just a shadow, it became his constant companion, creeping into his thoughts as he wondered what kind of king he had really been. He could no longer escape the reality that his quest for power, his endless marriages, his merciless executions, had all come at an immeasurable cost. A cost not only in the lives of his wives and enemies but in his relationship with his children, his family, and his own soul. Henry had spent a lifetime building his legacy, but in the silence of his final years, he began to see the cracks in the walls he had constructed. His greatest fear was not the loss of the crown but the loss of love, of human connection. His marriages, once a symbol of hope for a strong dynasty, had turned into a graveyard of broken promises. With each failure a mark on his soul, the weight of his decisions haunted him most in his relationship with his children, who represented both his legacy and his greatest failures. Edward VI, his much-desired male heir, was a child, too young to rule, too fragile to withstand the weight of the Tudor crown. Henry had dreamed of a son who would carry his name, but all he had was a boy with no power of his own. What Henry had longed for, the continuation of his dynasty, was now the source of his most profound fear. Did he leave his kingdom to a weak child? Had he wasted years trying to secure a male heir, only to leave England at the mercy of a child who had no idea how to handle the throne's weight? Henry's final moments were plagued by these questions. As the insecurity about his legacy ate away at him, the son who had been his salvation had become his greatest anxiety. And then there was Mary I, his first daughter. Their relationship had always been strained, but now, in his final days, he could no longer deny the distance between them. Mary's deep devotion to Catholicism was at odds with his own creation, the Church of England, and Henry knew this would create a religious storm in England. Yet, he felt no peace when thinking about her. She had been rejected by him, cast aside in favor of his political ambitions. What would happen to her? To the throne he had worked so hard to build. After his death, would she try to undo all he had done? Would her return to Catholicism tear the kingdom apart? The last of his daughters, Elizabeth I, held an even more complicated place in his heart. She was the product of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had brought Henry to the point of greatest triumph and greatest despair. Elizabeth's very existence was a reminder of Henry's greatest betrayal, the execution of Anne. Could he, in his final days, reconcile his actions with her future as queen? Elizabeth, the daughter of his greatest love and greatest mistake, would one day become England's greatest monarch. But Henry's last thoughts of her were clouded with regret. The price of power. Henry's reflection on his reign. As Henry lay dying, a sense of self-awareness began to take hold. The man who had once been so certain of his right to rule, whose power had seemed so unassailable, now faced the reality of his own mortality. The power that had shaped his world had now betrayed him, leaving him alone and vulnerable in his final hours. Was it worth it? He wondered. He had spent decades trying to secure his place in history. But now, as he faced his own death, he could only think of the lives he had destroyed in the process. His wives, Catherine, Anne, Jane, Catherine Howard, and Anne of Cleves, had all been casualties in his obsession with producing a male heir. Did he love them, or had they been nothing more than pawns in his grand scheme for the throne? His mind returned to Anne Boleyn, the woman who had ignited his passion and ultimately met her gruesome death at his command. Had he truly loved her, or had she simply been a means to an end? He had once believed she would be the answer to his prayers, the woman who would give him the son he so desperately needed. But instead, she gave him only a daughter, Elizabeth, the future queen, who would become the greatest monarch in English history, a monarch Henry himself never could have predicted. Was this what he had spent his life fighting for? Was the destruction of Anne and her legacy justified by the rise of Elizabeth? In his final moments, Henry was consumed by the realization that power, though it had once been his greatest desire, had not brought him peace. The pursuit of the crown had cost him his humanity. The need to secure his dynasty had come at the expense of his family, his heart, and his soul. The crown, once a symbol of glory, was now nothing more than a burden. He had been king, but in the end, he was only a man who had paid the price for his ambition. The last hours, a king facing his own demons. As the final hours of Henry's life ticked away, he could not escape the truth he had long avoided. The man who had spent a lifetime fighting against fate and destiny was now at the mercy of time and mortality. The king who had been the very embodiment of strength, vigor, and dominance was now a shadow of his former self, weakened, vulnerable, and haunted by the ghosts of his past decisions. Henry knew that his legacy, once certain, was now shrouded in uncertainty. He had sought to build an empire and secure his place in history. But now, at the brink of death, he could only wonder if he had lost more than he had gained. His desire for immortality had cost him everything: his family, his love, and even his peace of mind. He had shattered his relationships, destroyed his marriages, and executed those closest to him, all in the name of securing his throne. But in the end, he was left with nothing but regret and emptiness. The very thing he had wanted most, the dynasty he had fought so hard to protect, seemed so fragile in his final hours. And now, with death approaching, Henry was faced with the ultimate realization: he had built an empire. But at what cost? He had sacrificed everything for power, and in doing so, had lost the very thing that had been worth living for: the love and peace of his family. His heart, once so full of ambition, was now heavy with sorrow and remorse. Was it all worth it? As his last breath drew near, Henry's eyes closed, and he passed into the history books as a man who had built an empire but had lost himself in the process. The final judgment of Henry VIII. The death of Henry VIII was not simply the end of a king's reign. It was the end of an era, a period defined by ambition, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of power. Yet, in his final moments, Henry's thoughts were not on his legacy, but on the price he had paid for it. He had sacrificed so much: his family, his health, his humanity, all in the name of legacy. In the end, power had come at the cost of everything he held dear. Henry VIII may have been remembered as a king of greatness, but his final days were a testament to the costs of ambition and the price of power. His story, though one of strength and dominance, is also one of human frailty, tremendous loss, and the deep regret of a king who had everything but could never keep what truly mattered. As Henry VIII's legacy endures through history, his final days, marked by regret and reflection, serve as a powerful reminder that the cost of power can often outweigh the benefits, leaving behind a legacy that is as much defined by its pain as by its glory. Conclusion. Henry VIII's lasting legacy. Henry VIII, a man of great power and profound contradictions, changed the course of English and world history forever. His break from Rome and establishment of the Church of England reshaped not just England's religious landscape but also had a lasting impact on European politics and the Protestant Reformation. While his reign built a strong monarchy and secured England's sovereignty, it also ignited centuries of religious conflict and political strife. His personal life, marked by turbulent marriages and the execution of Anne Boleyn, remains shrouded in mystery, with unanswered questions about his true motivations, though his desire for a male heir ultimately left the throne to his children. Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I. His legacy was one of division and uncertainty, as his actions set the stage for future battles over religion, power, and succession. Henry's legacy is not one of pure glory, but of a king whose ambition and decisions created an empire while leaving a kingdom divided. He was a monarch whose personal ambition shaped not only his own reign but the future of England and its people, a king whose greatness and tragic flaws are still felt today. If you found Henry's story as fascinating and complex as I have, make sure to hit that like button, because this journey into the life of one of history's most legendary and controversial kings is far from over. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's most intriguing figures and events. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.